They laughed the second I walked into the gun store. My jacket was 10 years old. My boots were caked in mud from a 6-hour drive across 2 state lines. Nobody in that store had any idea I had just walked off a live fire evaluation range less than 8 hours earlier. They saw an old woman in a thrift store coat, and they decided in the space of half a second exactly who I was. They were wrong. And by the time a colonel walked through that door and snapped to attention in front of me, every single person in that building would understand just how wrong they'd been. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 45 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and for the better part of 2 decades I commanded specialized sniper units before moving into a role overseeing weapons evaluation for the Department of Defense. But none of that was written on my face that afternoon. What was written on my face was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after a week of inspecting training grounds in 90-degree heat, sleeping in motels with paper-thin walls and drinking gas station coffee because it was the only thing open at 4 in the morning. I hadn't planned on stopping at that particular store. It was on my route back a name that had come up more than once in procurement paperwork, and I figured I'd take 20 minutes to see the place with my own eyes before I wrote anything down. I didn't wear a uniform. I never do on these visits. The whole point is to see how a business treats an ordinary person walking in off the street, not how they treat an officer they're trying to impress. The bell above the door rang and I stepped inside, and I felt it immediately, that shift in the air when a room decides you don't belong in it. A young clerk behind the counter looked me up and down, taking in the jacket, the dust on my boots, the tired lines under my eyes, and he said loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Ma'am, Walmart's across the street." A ripple of laughter went through the customers browsing the rifle cases. Somebody near the ammunition counter, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt, chimed in without even looking up. "This is a real gun store, sweetheart. We don't sell decorations." I didn't say anything. I've been underestimated by men with far more rank than a flannel shirt and a mustache, and it stopped bothering me a long time ago. What did catch my attention was the woman near the front window, phone already raised, snapping a photo of me like I was some kind of roadside attraction. I heard the shutter click. I found out later what she posted underneath it: "Lost grandma at the gun shop." 12 likes within the first 10 minutes, according to the manager's own admission afterward. Small towns move fast when there's a joke to be had. I walked up to the counter anyway. My knees ached from the drive, my back was stiff, and I had exactly one thing on my mind before I could finally go home and sleep in my own bed for the first time in 9 days. "I'd like to see the Barrett M107A1, I said, keeping my voice, even the same voice I use when I'm reviewing a range safety violation with a 22-year-old private who thinks he knows better. The laughter got louder. The clerk actually put his hand over his mouth like he was trying to hold it in and failing. "Ma'am, do you have any idea what that rifle costs?" he asked, like I'd wandered in asking to test drive a fighter jet. I just smiled. It's a smile I've perfected over the years, the one that says nothing and gives nothing away, the one I wear in briefings when a general says something I know for a fact is incorrect, and I'm choosing my moment to correct him. I've learned that the quietest reaction unsettles people more than an argument ever could. Arguing gives them something to push against. Silence gives them nothing to hold on to. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, because I never gave them a reason to look past the jacket and the boots, was that I had personally reviewed procurement files on that exact rifle platform more times than I could count. I had sat across from defense contractors twice my size in conference rooms in the Pentagon, asking questions that made men in $1,000 suits sweat through their collars. I had stood on ranges in weather that would kill an unprepared soldier, and watched young men and women learn to trust a weapon system with their lives. None of that showed on the outside. That's the strange thing about a lifetime of service. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits quietly under the surface until something calls it forward. An old man sitting near the ammunition display off to the side in a folding chair with a Vietnam veteran's cap pulled low over his eyes wasn't laughing with the rest of them. I noticed him watching me, really watching the way soldiers watch each other, not at the clothes, not at the dust on the boots, but at the way a person carries their weight, the way their eyes move across a room cataloging exits and distances without even meaning to. Something in his expression shifted, like a man trying to place a familiar song he couldn't quite name. He didn't say a word. He just kept looking, and something in his gaze told me he already suspected what the rest of the room hadn't even considered. I didn't know it yet, but that old man's quiet attention was the first thread in an afternoon that was about to unravel every assumption in that building. The clerks kept laughing, the woman kept typing her caption, and I kept standing there in my worn jacket, patient, tired, and completely unbothered because I already knew something they didn't. I knew exactly who I was, and soon so would they. They weren't finished with me yet. If anything, my silence seemed to invite them further in like a dog that won't bark, just makes some people bolder. The clerk who'd made the Walmart comment disappeared into the back room and came out holding a cheap .22 rifle, the kind you'd buy a teenager for their first hunting trip, plastic stock-scratched barrel price tag, still curling at the corner. He set it on the counter in front of me with a little flourish, like he was presenting me a gift. "This one's more your speed," he said, and a couple of the customers nearby snickered. I looked down at it. I thought about all the weapons I'd held in my career, the ones I'd carried on my own back through terrain that would break a person's spirit, the ones I'd signed off on for units that trusted my judgment with their lives, the ones I'd rejected in procurement meetings, because some contractor tried to cut corners on a firing pin and thought nobody would notice. I thought about how far that cheap little rifle was from any of it, and how little this young man understood about what he was standing in front of. "I'll take a look at the Barrett when you're ready," I said again, calm, unhurried. He rolled his eyes at another employee, the kind of look people give each other when they think the joke has run its course, but they're not quite willing to let it go. A small crowd had gathered by then, drawn by the commotion the way people are always drawn to somebody else's embarrassment. A couple of men who looked like regulars, the type who spend their Saturday afternoons hanging around gun counters swapping stories, decided it would be funny to teach me how to hold a rifle properly. One of them took a display shotgun off the rack, walked over and mimed shouldering it in an exaggerated slow-motion way like he was speaking to a child. "See, ma'am, you tuck it right here," he said, tapping his own shoulder. "Wouldn't want it to kick you into next week." I let him talk. I've sat through worse in briefings from men who outranked me and were still wrong about basic ballistics. Correcting every fool who crosses your path isn't leadership, it's exhaustion. I'd learned a long time ago to save my energy for the moments that actually mattered. Somewhere near the back of the store, a young man with a ring light clipped to his phone had been filming the whole thing. I hadn't noticed him at first. He'd been recording from an angle by the ammunition shelves, and it was only when he stepped closer, grinning phone held sideways, that I realized what he was doing. He was already narrating for whatever audience he had waiting online. "Y'all are not gonna believe this," he said under his breath, loud enough that I caught it anyway. "Karen thinks she's a sniper." A few people laughed at that too. I felt something tighten in my chest, not embarrassment, something closer to a controlled anger, the kind I'd trained myself to sit with rather than let loose. I'd spent my whole career being underestimated by men who thought volume was the same thing as authority. This was nothing new. It just stung in a different way out here in front of strangers who had no idea what they were mocking. "Have you ever even fired a gun before?" one of the clerks asked, not bothering to hide the smirk. "Yes," I said. "How many times?" "I don't remember anymore," I said, and I meant it honestly. There is no number for the years I'd spent on ranges and training exercises, in evaluations, in places I'm not permitted to discuss in detail even now. The truth was so far beyond what they were expecting that it read to them as a punchline instead of an answer. They laughed harder, thinking I dodged the question, because I didn't have a real one. Through all of it, the old veteran in the corner hadn't moved. He'd taken off his cap and was turning it slowly in his hands, watching me with an intensity that had nothing playful in it anymore. I noticed his eyes drop to my hands at one point, to the calluses that don't come from typing at a desk, to the way I stood with my weight evenly balanced ready without looking ready. Men who've spent real time in the field recognize that stance in each other even decades later. It's not something you can fake, and it's not something you forget how to read. I asked finally if I could see a particular configuration in the display case, a modified rifle set up with adjustments that I recognized immediately as a specification the military had recently requested from select manufacturers. It wasn't something a casual customer would think to ask about. It wasn't even something most gun store employees would recognize on sight. The clerk actually blinked, caught off guard for the first time since I'd walked in. "That one's a special order," he said, some of the swagger draining out of his voice. "How do you even know about that?" I didn't answer right away. I just watched him pull it carefully from the case, the mockery in the room dimming slightly, replaced by something more like confusion. The first crack in the story they'd all decided to tell themselves about who I was. I could feel the shift the way you feel a change in weather before the first drop of rain falls, nothing dramatic. Yet, just a stillness settling in where the laughter used to be. I reached for the rifle and something in me, something I'd carried through years of ranges and reviews and rooms full of men who doubted me long before these strangers ever had the chance, settled into place. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. I always am. I turned the rifle over in my hands, feeling the balance of it, the weight distributed exactly the way I remembered from a dozen procurement reviews back at the Pentagon. The store had gone quieter now, not silent, but quieter, the kind of hush that settles over a room when people sense they've wandered somewhere they don't understand but aren't sure how to back out gracefully. I ran my thumb along the receiver, checked the sight alignment, and set it down gently on the felt-lined counter. "The firing pin's off," I said. "About 0.2 of a millimeter if I had to guess." The clerk laughed, but it was thinner this time, less sure of itself. "Lady, that's not something you can just eyeball." "Have your gunsmith check it," I said. "I'll wait." There was a pause, the kind where everyone in a room looks at everyone else to see who's going to be the one to call the bluff. Finally, an older man in a canvas apron, the store's actual gunsmith by the look of the tools hanging off his belt, stepped out from a back workshop where he'd clearly been listening to the whole exchange. He picked up the rifle without a word, walked it over to a bench along the wall, and ran it through a quick diagnostic with a set of gauges I recognized from my own inspection kits. He looked up and something had changed in his face. "She's right," he said, quiet almost to himself. 0.2 off. How in the world did she catch that just looking at it? Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. The laughter that had filled the store just minutes earlier had curdled into something else, an uneasy murmur, the sound of people trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they'd already decided to believe. A customer near the ammunition shelf, one of the men who'd been mocking my grip earlier, asked the question everyone else seemed to want to ask, but was too embarrassed to voice. "How did you know that?" I thought about how much I could say, and how much I should. There's a discipline to keeping quiet about your work, one that becomes second nature after enough years around classified programs and closed-door briefings. But this wasn't a classified matter. This was simply a truth they weren't ready for. "I've signed off on more than 3,000 rifles built to that configuration," I said. The room didn't laugh this time. Nobody quite knew what to do with a sentence like that coming from a woman they'd spent the last 20 minutes mocking for supposedly not knowing how to hold a shotgun. A few people exchanged glances, the kind that said without words, "This can't be true, can it?" The YouTuber in the back had lowered his phone slightly, though the little red recording light was still blinking, capturing every second of a story that was quickly slipping out of his control. "That's not possible," the first clerk said, but there was no conviction behind it anymore, just a young man grasping for the version of reality that let him keep his dignity intact. "You don't look like—" He stopped himself, maybe realizing halfway through the sentence how that was going to sound out loud. "Like what?" I asked, not unkindly, just curious to hear him finish the thought he'd already started. He didn't answer. Nobody in that store did. The gunsmith was still holding the rifle, turning it over in his hands, like he was seeing it differently now, like the machine itself had somehow become more serious in light of what I'd just told them. The old veteran in the corner had risen from his folding chair, slow and deliberate, the way older men move when their knees have earned the right to take their time. He was watching me now with none of the curiosity from before, only a dawning, careful recognition, like a man flipping through the pages of his own memory, trying to find where he'd seen this face, this bearing, this quiet certainty once before. "I don't believe her," the flannel-shirted man muttered to the person next to him, low but not low enough. "She's making it up. Nobody just walks in off the street and knows procurement specs like that." I let the comment pass. I understood in a way why they needed to believe that. It's easier to accept that a stranger is lying than to accept you've spent the last half hour humiliating someone who could, with a single phone call, unravel the foundation of everything your business depends on. Pride works that way. It builds its own walls faster than facts can tear them down. But even as the doubt lingered in some corners of the room, something had undeniably shifted. The mockery had stopped. The laughter had stopped. In its place was a nervous, unsettled energy, the kind that comes when people sense the ground moving beneath them, but can't yet see how far the crack extends. The manager, who had been hovering near the office door through most of this, finally stepped forward. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and the first stirrings of genuine concern. "Ma'am," he said, carefully testing out a word that hadn't been used toward me all afternoon, "is there something we can help you with?" I looked at him, at the whole room really, at the faces that had laughed at my jacket and my boots and my tired eyes, without once wondering what those things might be hiding. "We'll see," I said. Outside, through the front windows, I caught the first flash of headlights pulling into the lot, followed by a second set, then a third. Whatever was about to walk through that door, I had a feeling it was going to answer every question this room still had about who I really was. The engines outside cut off one after another, and through the front windows I watched 3 government vehicles pull into the lot in careful formation, the kind of parking discipline you only see from drivers who've been trained to move as a unit. A few customers near the window turned to look, curiosity replacing whatever unease had been building in the room a moment before. The manager straightened his shirt collar without seeming to notice he was doing it, the universal reflex of a man sensing that something official was about to walk through his door. The bell above the entrance rang sharper this time, more deliberate than my own quiet arrival had been. A colonel stepped through first dress uniform crisp, despite the heat outside, followed by 2 military police officers, who positioned themselves near the entrance the way I'd trained hundreds of soldiers to do 1,000 times before. The gun store employees straightened instinctively the way people do around uniforms, even when they don't understand exactly what they're looking at. I heard the flannel-shirted man mutter something to his friend about a bulk order, some half-formed guess that the army had come to make a purchase. The colonel's eyes swept the room, once methodical trained, the way mine had swept it when I first walked in. Then his gaze landed on me, and something in his posture changed instantly. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. Before anyone in that store had time to process what was happening, he snapped to attention and raised his hand in a salute so sharp it could have been used in a training manual. "Good afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks," he said, his voice carrying clean across the entire showroom. I have spent 20 years learning to keep my composure in rooms far more hostile than that one, but I will admit there was a small private satisfaction in the silence that followed his words. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was the sound of an entire room's assumptions collapsing all at once, a silence so complete I could hear the hum of the refrigerated ammunition case in the corner. The clerk who'd made the Walmart joke went the color of the drywall behind him. The rifle he'd been holding, the cheap one, the one more, your speed, slipped out of his hands and clattered onto the counter, the sound absurdly loud in a room that had gone dead quiet. Somewhere behind me I heard the distinct click of a phone camera being lowered, then powered off entirely. The YouTuber apparently had decided this was no longer footage he wanted his name attached to. "Ma'am," the colonel continued, lowering his salute but keeping his posture rigid. "My apologies for the wait. Traffic on the interstate." "No apology necessary, Colonel," I said. "I appreciate you making the drive." He nodded, then turned his attention briefly toward the manager whose face had shifted through at least 3 separate emotions in the space of 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked uncomfortably close to dread. "Sir," the colonel said, addressing him directly, "I trust everyone here has been made aware they're speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Brooks, currently overseeing the Department of Defense's Weapons Evaluation and Procurement Review Program." I watched the sentence land on each face in that room individually, like watching dominoes fall one at a time, instead of all at once. The gunsmith, still holding the modified rifle, actually took a small step backward, as if putting distance between himself and the counter might undo the last 20 minutes. The man in the flannel shirt suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the floor. The woman who'd taken my photo earlier had gone pale, her phone now held loosely at her side, the smug caption she'd written no longer feeling quite so clever. The old veteran in the corner was the only one in the room who didn't look surprised. He was nodding slowly to himself like a man who'd just confirmed a suspicion he'd been circling for the better part of an hour. Our eyes met across the room, and he gave me the smallest nod, the kind exchanged between people who've spent time in places that don't show up on maps. I nodded back. "I don't understand," the manager said, finally finding his voice, though it came out smaller than I imagine he intended. "You're Lieutenant Colonel. You came in here and you didn't say anything." "I wasn't here to say anything," I told him. "I was here to observe." The word landed heavier than I expected it to. I watched him turn it over, watched the shape of what I meant start to take form behind his eyes. The same slow dawning of dread I'd have expected from any manager who suddenly realized that the last half hour of his employee's behavior had been witnessed by someone with the authority to actually do something about it. The colonel stepped closer to me, lowering his voice slightly, though not so low that the room couldn't still hear most of it. "The team has everything documented, ma'am, exactly as requested. Would you like to review it here or back at the vehicle?" I looked around the store one more time, at the cheap rifle still sitting on the counter where it had fallen, at the woman's phone, dark, now held against her side like she was trying to make it disappear, at the young clerk who'd told me less than an hour ago that this was a real gun store and not a place for decorations. "Here's fine," I said. "I think everyone in this room deserves to understand exactly what they've been part of." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a joke that had run its course. It was the silence of people beginning to understand in real time that the ground beneath their feet had never been as solid as they'd assumed. The colonel opened a slim folder one of the MPs had carried in from the vehicle and set it on the counter, angled so I could see it, but not turning it toward the crowd just yet. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew what it contained because I'd requested every page of it myself 3 weeks earlier, back when this store's name first crossed my desk in a stack of federal supplier applications waiting on review. "For those of you who don't know," I said, turning to face the room instead of the folder, "I'm not here to buy a rifle. I'm here because this store submitted an application to become an approved federal supplier for military-grade weapons and modification services. That application is currently under review by my office." The manager's mouth opened slightly, then closed again like a man trying to find footing on ice that kept shifting under him. You mean, this whole time, I confirmed, I was conducting an unannounced evaluation, not of your inventory, of how this business treats the people who walk through that door. I let that settle for a moment before continuing. I've given enough briefings in my career to know that silence does more work than any speech, that people absorb hard truths more completely when you give them room to sit with the weight of it, rather than rushing past it to soften the blow. "There's a camera in the strap of my bag," I said, nodding toward the worn canvas satchel I'd set on the counter when I first walked in, the one nobody had given a second glance because nobody looks twice at an old woman's purse. "It's been recording since I walked through that door. Everything. The comment about Walmart, the photograph taken of me without my consent, the cheap rifle handed to me as a joke, the video being filmed for what I assume was intended to be entertainment at my expense. The YouTuber who had been trying to make himself smaller near the back wall for the last several minutes looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. I didn't post it," he said quickly to no one in particular. "I swear I didn't post it yet." "That's not really the point, is it?" I said, and I meant it gently, though I understood it wouldn't land that way. The Colonel picked up where I left off, his tone, even more clinical than mine, the tone of a man reading findings rather than delivering a verdict, though the effect on the room was much the same. "The department evaluates prospective suppliers on several criteria beyond product quality," he said. "Professionalism, customer treatment, ethical business conduct, consistency in how staff represent the company to the public, regardless of who that member of the public happens to be." He paused, letting his eyes move slowly across the clerks standing frozen behind the counter. Today's visit provided a fairly comprehensive answer on several of those fronts. The manager stepped forward then, and I watched something crumble in his expression, the practiced professionalism a business owner wears like armor giving way to something rawer and more desperate underneath. "Ma'am, please, if I can just explain, these are good employees. They didn't mean any harm. It got out of hand. I should have stepped in sooner. You were standing right there," I said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. For most of it. He had no answer for that because there wasn't one. I've sat across from generals who couldn't out-argue a fact that plainly stated, and this man standing in his own store surrounded by his own employees and his own choices had even less ground to stand on than they did. I turned to the room at large, my voice steady, the same voice I use when addressing a formation of soldiers who need to hear something they don't want to hear. "I want to be clear about something. This isn't about rank. It isn't about a uniform or a title, or the fact that a colonel happened to walk through that door and salute me. If I'd walked in here in the same jacket and boots, and nobody had ever found out who I was, the way you all treated me would have been exactly the same. That's the part that matters. That's the part I'll be including in my report." The old veteran in the corner spoke for the first time since the colonel arrived, his voice rough with age, but carrying easily across the quiet room. "She's right," he said. "Doesn't matter what rank walks through that door. Matters how you treat the fella who might not have any rank at all." I looked over at him and felt something settle in my chest. A small, quiet gratitude for a stranger who understood without needing it. Explained to him exactly what this moment was really about. He'd seen it the whole time. He'd seen it before the colonel ever pulled into that lot, before any uniform gave the room permission to take me seriously. He'd simply recognized something true in the way I carried myself, and he hadn't needed a salute to believe it. The manager sank down onto a stool behind the counter, running a hand over his face, the weight of what was coming clearly settling in, even before I'd said another word about what would happen next. The clerks stood frozen, none of them quite meeting my eyes anymore, the mockery of an hour ago, replaced by the particular silence of people watching consequences arrive in real time, and realizing there's nothing left to say that will stop them. I picked my satchel back up off the counter, feeling its familiar weight against my shoulder, and I looked at the Colonel. "I have everything I need," I said. He nodded, and for the first time since I'd walked into that store, I allowed myself to exhale. The report took a week to finalize, though I knew within the first 48 hours exactly what it was going to say. I've written enough evaluations in my career to recognize when a conclusion has already written itself, when the evidence is so complete that the only work left is organizing it into language clean enough for a review board to act on without hesitation. I didn't gloat over any of it. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this part of the story with some satisfaction, some sense of righteous payback dressed up as professional duty. But there's no pleasure in watching a business collapse, even one that earned its collapse through its own choices. What I felt mostly was a kind of tired clarity, the sense of having done a job the way it was supposed to be done, nothing more. The store lost its bid for the federal supplier contract within days of my report reaching the review board. That alone would have been a significant blow, the kind of lost revenue that keeps an owner up at night doing math that doesn't work out in his favor. But it didn't stop there. Word travels fast among defense contractors, faster than most people realize. And being dropped from consideration for one federal contract has a way of raising questions about every other contract a business is currently holding. Within 3 weeks, the store had been removed from 2 additional supplier lists, entirely unrelated to my office businesses that had heard enough secondhand about what happened and decided they didn't want their name anywhere near the fallout. The owner, a man I never actually met in person, put the business up for sale less than 2 months later. I heard this through the Colonel, who kept me updated as the paperwork worked its way through channels I don't often get visibility into once a report leaves my desk. Apparently the sale wasn't handled quietly. Word of why the business was struggling had already spread through the local community, helped along, I imagine, by customers who had their own stories to tell about how they'd been treated in that store over the years. Stories that suddenly found a more receptive audience once mine had come to light. The clerk who'd made the Walmart comment, along with 2 others who'd been most vocal that afternoon, were let go before the sale even went through. I don't know the details of those conversations, and honestly, I didn't ask. Some things aren't mine to know. What I do know is that in an economy where jobs like that aren't always easy to walk into and out of, the consequences landed harder than a fine or a bad review ever could have. The YouTuber's story took its own strange turn. He never posted the footage from that day. I suspect he understood, standing there watching the Colonel salute me, exactly how badly that video would have aged the moment it went public. But somehow word got out anyway. Maybe someone in the store talked. Maybe another customer pieced it together and shared it themselves. Either way, within 2 weeks, veterans groups across several social media platforms had picked up the story, and it wasn't kind to him. He deleted his channel's most recent uploads and posted something that read more like damage control than an apology. I saw screenshots of it eventually forwarded to me by someone on my staff who thought I'd want to know. I didn't feel much reading it. By then, I'd already moved on to the next stack of paperwork on my desk. The woman who'd photographed me and posted that caption about a lost grandmother did eventually apologize publicly on the same platform where she'd first posted the photo. I read it once. It was fine as far as apologies go. She took responsibility. She didn't try to justify herself. She acknowledged what she'd done was cruel and said she was ashamed of it. I believed her for what it's worth. People do foolish things in the moment, caught up in a crowd's energy, and most of them are capable of recognizing it later, once the crowd has scattered and they're left alone with what they actually did. But here's the part that surprised me, if I'm being honest with myself. None of it, not the lost contract, not the firings, not the public apologies, not even the store changing hands entirely, none of it felt like the actual point of what had happened. I kept turning that over during the week the report was being finalized, trying to understand why the consequences, deserved as they were, didn't sit with me the way I expected them to. What I kept coming back to was something the old veteran had said standing in the corner of that store while everyone else scrambled to make sense of what was unfolding. Doesn't matter what rank walks through that door, matters how you treat the fella who might not have any rank at all. That sentence stayed with me longer than any of the disciplinary outcomes did. It was the truest thing said in that entire store that afternoon, truer than anything in my own report. And it came from a man who'd spent his whole life understanding something that a room full of people, 20 and 30 years younger than him, still hadn't learned. I thought about all the people who walk into places like that every single day, tired, ordinary, unremarkable-looking people carrying whole lives nobody bothers to ask about, and how many of them never get the benefit of a colonel walking through the door to set the record straight. Most people don't have that. Most people just absorb the insult and go home and carry it quietly the way I nearly did myself, if circumstances hadn't happened to align the way they did. That thought sat with me for a long time. And 3 months later, it was the reason I found myself pulling back into that same parking lot, wanting to see for myself what, if anything, had actually changed. The store looked different before I even stepped out of my car. New signage above the door, fresh paint along the front windows, a small flag decal in the corner of the glass that hadn't been there before. I sat in the parking lot for a moment longer than I needed to, watching people come and go through the entrance, trying to gauge from the outside whether anything underneath the paint had actually changed, or whether this was just a new coat over the same old bones. I want to be honest about something. I hadn't planned this visit as any kind of victory lap. I'm not built that way. And frankly, 3 months of paperwork and follow-up reviews on other suppliers had mostly pushed that afternoon into a corner of my memory I didn't revisit often. But something about the old veteran's words had stayed lodged in me quietly, the way certain truths do, and when my schedule brought me back through that part of the state, I found myself taking the exit without fully deciding to. The bell above the door rang the same way it had 3 months earlier, but everything else about walking inside felt entirely different. A young woman behind the counter looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't calculate anything. First, didn't measure my jacket or my boots before deciding whether I was worth her attention. "Welcome in," she said. "Let me know if you need help finding anything." I nodded and moved slowly through the aisles in no particular hurry, watching the store the way I might watch a training exercise, looking for the small tells that reveal whether a change is real or just performance for whoever happens to be watching that day. It was real. I saw it clearest in a moment that had nothing to do with me at all. A man walked in not long after I did, older, maybe close to 70, wearing a coat that had clearly seen better winters. A duffel bag slung over one shoulder that told its own quiet story about where he might be sleeping that night. I recognized something in the way he moved, the careful, watchful posture of someone used to being brushed off before he even opens his mouth. The posture I imagine I'd worn myself walking in 3 months earlier without realizing it. A clerk, a different young man than the ones I remembered, came around the counter immediately. Not with pity. Not with the exaggerated performative kindness some people put on when they want witnesses to see how generous they're being. Just simple, unhurried attention. "Afternoon," he said. "Anything I can help you find today?" The older man hesitated, like he was bracing for the brush-off he'd probably received 100 times in 100 other stores. When it didn't come, something in his shoulders eased just slightly. "Just looking mostly," he said. "Haven't been in a place like this in a while." "Take your time," the clerk said, and then, without making a show of it, "Can I get you a coffee pot's fresh in the back?" The old man blinked, surprised, and nodded, and the clerk disappeared for a moment and came back with a paper cup, handing it over, like it was nothing at all, like this was simply what you did for a person who walked through your door, any person regardless of the coat they were wearing or the bag they were carrying. I watched him settle the old man into a chair near the counter and start walking him through a few options, patient, unhurried. genuinely listening to what the man was actually looking for rather than steering him toward whatever was easiest to sell. I felt something loosen in my chest watching that. It wasn't pride exactly, not in the sense of feeling responsible for what I was seeing. It was something quieter than that, more like relief, the kind you feel when a thing you hoped was true turns out to actually be true. The new manager came around from the back office partway through my visit and recognized me almost immediately, his expression shifting the way people's expressions do when they're bracing to explain themselves to someone they assume is still owed an explanation. He started to straighten some old instinct rising in him to stand at attention, the way the colonel had that afternoon 3 months ago. I held up a hand before he could get very far into it. "You don't need to salute me," I said, keeping my voice light, though I meant it fully. He looked a little uncertain, unsure what was expected of him instead. I nodded toward the old man still sitting with his coffee still being walked patiently through his options by the young clerk. "Treat him with the same respect," I said. "That's the only greeting I need." The manager followed my gaze and I watched understanding settle into his face. Real understanding, not the performative kind meant to satisfy an inspector standing in his store. "We try to run it that way now," he said. "Every day, not just when someone's watching." I can see that I told him and I meant it. I didn't stay much longer after that. I bought nothing that day, which felt right somehow. Like the whole point of the visit had never really been about the merchandise, not the first time, and not this time either. I walked back out through the same door I'd walked in through 3 months earlier, past the same bell that had rung the same way both times, and got into my car without a single person in that store knowing who I was. Nobody stood at attention. Nobody saluted. And driving away from that parking lot, I realized I liked it better that way, far better than any military courtesy I'd ever received. Because the respect I'd just watched, quiet, unforced, extended freely to a stranger who had nothing to offer anyone in return, was worth more to me than any salute could ever be. People can judge a person by their clothes in a matter of seconds. But a person's real character only shows itself in how they treat the ones they've decided don't matter. Real respect was never about rank or uniform or title. It belongs to every human being from the very first moment you meet them. If this story moved something in you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep walking this road together.